The Armistice of the 11th of November 1918 was an armistice during the First World War between the Allies and Germany, also known as the Armistice of Compiègne after the location in which it was signed, and the agreement that ended the fighting on the Western Front. It went into effect at 11 a.m. Paris time on the 11th of November 1918, and marked a victory for the Allies and a complete defeat for Germany, although not formally a surrender. The Germans were responding to the policies proposed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points of January 1918. The actual terms, largely written by French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, included the cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of German troops to behind their own borders, the preservation of infrastructure, the exchange of prisoners, a promise of reparations, the disposition of German warships and submarines, and conditions for prolonging or terminating the armistice. Although the armistice ended the actual fighting, it took 6 months of negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference to conclude the peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles. October 1918 telegrams. On 29 September 1918 the German Supreme Army Command informed Kaiser Wilhelm II and the Imperial Chancellor, Count Georg von Hertling at Imperial Army Headquarters in Spa of occupied Belgium, that the military situation facing Germany was hopeless. Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, probably fearing a breakthrough, claimed that he could not guarantee that the front would hold for another 24 hours and demanded a request be given to the Entente for an immediate ceasefire. In addition, he recommended the acceptance of the main demands of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, including putting the imperial government on a democratic footing, hoping for more favorable peace terms. This enabled him to save the face of the Imperial German Army and put the responsibility for the capitulation and its consequences squarely into the hands of the democratic parties and the parliament. As he said to officers of his staff on 1 October, "They now must lie on the bed that they've made for us." On 3 October, the liberal Prince Maximilian of Baden was appointed Chancellor of Germany, replacing Georg von Hertling in order to negotiate an armistice. After long conversations with the Kaiser and evaluations of the political and military situations in the Reich, by 5 October 1918, the German government sent a message to President Wilson to negotiate terms on the basis of a recent speech of his and the earlier declared 14 points. In the subsequent 2 exchanges, Wilson's allusions failed to convey the idea that the Kaiser's abdication was an essential condition for peace. The leading statesmen of the Reich were not yet ready to contemplate such a monstrous possibility as a precondition for negotiations. Wilson demanded the retreat of Germany from all occupied territories, the cessation of submarine activities and the Kaiser's abdication. Writing on 23 October, "If the government of the United States must deal with the military masters and the monarchical autocrats of Germany now, or if it is likely to have to deal with them later in regard to the international obligations of the German Empire, it must demand not peace negotiations but surrender." In late October, Ludendorff, in a sudden change of mind, declared the conditions of the Allies unacceptable. He now demanded to resume the war which he himself had declared lost only 1 month earlier. However, the German soldiers were pressing to get home. It was scarcely possible to arouse their readiness for battle anew, and desertions were on the increase. The imperial government stayed on course and Ludendorff was replaced by Wilhelm Graener. On 5 November, the Allies agreed to take up negotiations for a truce, now also demanding reparation payments. The latest note from Wilson was received in Berlin on 6 November. That same day, the delegation led by Matthias Erzberger departed for France. A much bigger obstacle, which contributed to the 5-week delay in the signing of the armistice and to the resulting social deterioration in Europe, was the fact that the French, British and Italian governments had no desire to accept the 14 points, and President Wilson's subsequent promises. For example, they assumed that the demilitarization suggested by Wilson would be limited to the Central Powers. There were also contradictions with their post-war plans that did not include a consistent implementation of the ideal of national self-determination. As Chenon points out, the Allied statesmen were faced with a problem. So far they had considered the 14 Commandments as a piece of clever and effective American propaganda, designed primarily to undermine the fighting spirit of the Central Powers, and to bolster the morale of the lesser allies. Now, suddenly, the whole peace structure was supposed to be built up on that set of vague principles, most of which seemed to them thoroughly unrealistic, and some of which, if they were to be seriously applied, were simply unacceptable. German Revolution. The Sailors' Revolt, which took place during the night of 29 to 30 October 1918 in the naval port of Wilhelmshaven, spread across the whole country within days and led to the proclamation of a republic on 9 November 1918 and to the announcement of the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Also on 9 November, Max von Baden handed over the office of Chancellor to Friedrich Ebert, a Social Democrat. Ebert's SPD and Erzberger's Catholic Centre Party had enjoyed an uneasy relationship with the imperial government since Bismarck's era in the 1870s and 1880s. They were well represented in the Imperial Reichstag, which had little power over the government, and had been calling for a negotiated peace since 1917. Their prominence in the peace negotiations would cause the new Weimar Republic to lack legitimacy in right-wing and militarist eyes. Negotiation process. The armistice was the result of a hurried and desperate process. The German delegation headed by Matthias Erzberger crossed the front line in 5 cars and was escorted for 10 hours across the devastated war zone of northern France. Arriving on the morning of the 8th of November, they were then entrained and taken to the secret destination. Aboard Ferdinand Foch's private train parked in a railway siding in the forest of Compiègne. Foch appeared only twice in the 3 days of negotiations. On the first day, to ask the German delegation what they wanted, and on the last day, to see to the signatures. The Germans were handed a list of Allied demands and given 72 hours to agree. The German delegation discussed the Allied terms not with Foch, but with other French and Allied officers. The armistice amounted to complete German demilitarization, with few promises made by the Allies in return. The naval blockade of Germany was not completely lifted until complete peace terms could be agreed upon. There was no question of negotiation. The Germans were able to correct a few impossible demands, extended the schedule for the withdrawal and registered their formal protest to the harshness of Allied terms. But they were in no position to refuse to sign. On Sunday the 10th of November, they were shown newspapers from Paris to inform them that the Kaiser had abdicated. That same day, Erzberger was instructed to sign by Ebert. The cabinet had earlier received a message from Hindenburg, requesting that the armistice be signed even if the Allied conditions could not be improved on. The armistice was agreed at 5 a.m. on the 11th of November, to come into effect at 11 a.m. Paris time, for which reason the occasion is sometimes referred to as the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Signatures were made between 5:12 a.m. and 5:20 a.m. Paris time. Allied Rhineland occupation. The occupation of the Rhineland took place following the armistice. The occupying armies consisted of American, Belgian, British, and French forces. Prolongation. The armistice was prolonged 3 times before peace was finally ratified. First armistice. First prolongation of the armistice. Second prolongation of the armistice. Third prolongation of the armistice. Peace was ratified at 4:15 p.m. on the 10th of January 1920. The armistice carriage. The armistice was signed in a carriage of Foch's private train, CIWL number 2419. It was later put back into regular service with the Compagnie des Wagons Lits. but after a short period it was withdrawn to be attached to the French presidential train. From April 1921 to April 1927, it was on exhibition in the Cour des Invalides in Paris. In November 1927, it was ceremonially returned to the forest in the exact spot where the armistice was signed. Marshal Foch, General Weygand and many others watched it being placed in a specially constructed building, the Clarierie de l'Armistice. There it remained, a monument to the defeat of the Kaiser's Germany, until the 22nd of June 1940, when swastika-bedecked German staff cars bearing Adolf Hitler, Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, Joachim von Ribbentrop and others swept into the Clarierie and, in that same carriage, demanded and received the surrender armistice from France. During the occupation of France, the Clarierie de l'Armistice was destroyed and the carriage taken to Berlin, where it was exhibited in the Lustgarten. After the Allied advance into Germany in early 1945, the carriage was removed by the Germans for safekeeping to the town of Ohrdruf. But as an American armored column entered the town, the detachment of the SS guarding it set it ablaze, and it was destroyed. Some pieces were, however, preserved by a private person. They are also exhibited at Compiègne. After the war, the Compiègne site was restored, but not until Armistice Day 1950 was a replacement carriage, correct in every detail, rededicated. An identical Compagnie des Wagon-Lits carriage, No. 2439, built in 1913 in the same batch as the original and present in 1918, was renumbered No. 2419D. Key personnel. For the Allies, the personnel involved were all military. Marshal of France Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander. General Maxime Weygand, Foch's Chief of Staff. First Sea Lord Admiral Rosslyn Weems, the British representative. Rear Admiral George Hope, Deputy First Sea Lord. Captain Jack Marriott, British naval officer, naval assistant to the First Sea Lord. For Germany, Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician. Count Alfred von Obendorf, from the Foreign Ministry. Major General Detloff von Winterfeldt, Army. Captain Ernst van Sillo, Navy. General Weygand and General von Gruenel are not mentioned in the French copy of the armistice document. Terms. Among its 35 terms, the armistice contained the following major points. Termination of military hostilities on land or in air within 6 hours of signature. Immediate removal of all German troops from France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Alsace-Lorraine within 14 days. Subsequent removal of all German troops from territory on the west side of the Rhine plus 30 km radius bridgeheads of the right side of the Rhine at the cities of Mainz, Koblenz, and Cologne with ensuing occupation by Allied and U.S. troops. Removal of all German troops on the Eastern Front, Turkey, Austro-Hungary and Romania, to German territory as it was on 1 August 1914. Troops on Russian territory to be removed once the Allies deem the time right. Renunciation of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia, and of the Treaty of Bucharest with Romania. Internment of the German fleet. Surrender of all German submarines. Surrender of materiel. 5,000 cannons, 25,000 machine guns, 3,000 Minenwerfers, 1,700 airplanes, 5,000 locomotive engines, and 150,000 railcars. Immediate release of all French, British and Italian prisoners of war. Aftermath. The British public was notified of the armistice by a subjoined official communiqué issued from the Press Bureau at 10:20 a.m., when British Prime Minister David Lloyd George announced, "The armistice was signed at 5 o'clock this morning, and hostilities are to cease on all fronts at 11 a.m. Today." An official communiqué was published by the United States at 2:30 p.m. In accordance with the terms of the armistice, hostilities on the fronts of the American armies were suspended at 11 o'clock this morning. News of the armistice being signed was officially announced towards 9 a.m. in Paris. 1 hour later, Foch, accompanied by a British admiral, presented himself at the Ministry of War, where he was immediately received by Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. At 10:50 a.m. Foch issued this general order: hostilities will cease on the whole front as from November 11 at 11 o'clock French time the Allied troops will not, until further order, go beyond the line reached on that date and at that hour. 5 minutes later, Clemenceau, Foch and the British admiral went to the Élysée Palace. At the first shot fired from the Eiffel Tower, the Ministry of War and the Élysée Palace displayed flags, while bells around Paris rang. 500 students gathered in front of the ministry and called upon Clemenceau, who appeared on the balcony. Clemenceau exclaimed, "Vive la France!" The crowd echoed him. At 11 a.m., the first peace gunshot was fired from Fort Mont-Valérien, which told the population of Paris that the armistice was concluded. But the population were already aware of it from official circles and newspapers. Although the information about the imminent ceasefire had spread among the forces at the front in the hours before, fighting in many sections of the front continued right until the appointed hour. At 11 a.m. there was some spontaneous fraternization between the two sides, but in general, reactions were muted. A British corporal reported, "The Germans came from their trenches, bowed to us and then went away. That was it. There was nothing with which we could celebrate, except cookies." On the Allied side, euphoria and exultation were rare. There was some cheering and applause, but the dominant feeling was silence and emptiness after 52 exhausting months of war. The peace between the Allies and Germany was subsequently settled in 1919, by the Paris Peace Conference, and the Treaty of Versailles that same year. Last casualties. Many artillery units continued to fire on German targets to avoid having to haul away their spare ammunition. The Allies also wished to ensure that, should fighting restart, they would be in the most favorable position. Consequently, there were 10,944 casualties, of which 2,738 men died on the last day of the war. An example of the determination of the Allies to maintain pressure until the last minute, but also to adhere strictly to the armistice terms, was Battery 4 of the U.S. Navy's long-range 14-inch railway guns firing its last shot at 10:57:30 am from the Verdun area, timed to land far behind the German front line just before the scheduled armistice. Augustin Trebuchet was the last Frenchman to die when he was shot on his way to tell fellow soldiers, who were attempting an assault across the Meuse River, that hot soup would be served after the ceasefire. He was killed at 10:45 a.m. The last soldier from the UK to die, George Edwin Ellison of the 5th Royal Irish Lancers, was killed earlier that morning at around 9:30 a.m. while scouting on the outskirts of Mons, Belgium. The final Canadian and Commonwealth soldier to die, Private George Lawrence Price, was shot and killed by a sniper while part of a force advancing into the town of Ville-sur-Aisne just 2 minutes before the armistice to the north of Mons at 10:58 a.m. to be recognized as one of the last killed with a monument to his name. And finally, American Henry Guenther is generally recognized as the last soldier killed in action in World War I. He was killed 60 seconds before the armistice came into force while charging astonished German troops who were aware the armistice was nearly upon them. He had been despondent over his recent reduction in rank and was apparently trying to redeem his reputation. Legacy. Celebration of the armistice became the centerpiece of memories of the war, along with salutes to the unknown soldier. Nations built monuments to the dead and the heroic soldiers, but seldom to the generals and admirals. The 11th of November is commemorated annually in many countries under various names such as Armistice Day, Remembrance Day, Veterans Day, and in Poland it is Independence Day. The end of the Second World War in China formally took place on the 9th of September 1945 at 900 The date was chosen in echo of the armistice of the 11th of November 1918, and because 9 is homophone of the word for long-lasting in Chinese. Stab in the back myth. The myth that the German army was stabbed in the back by the Social Democratic government that was formed in November 1918 was created by reviews in the German press that grossly misrepresented General Frederick Barton Morris's book, The Last 4 Months. Ludendorff made use of the reviews to convince Hindenburg, in a hearing before the Committee on Inquiry of the National Assembly on November 18, 1919, a year after the war's end. Hindenburg declared, as an English general has very truly said, the German army was stabbed in the back. Bibliography. Best, Nicholas. The Greatest Day in History. How, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the First World War finally came to an end. New York City. Public Affairs. ISBN 978-1-58648-772-0. OCLC 191,926,322. Breck, Edward. The United States Naval Railway Batteries in France. Department of the Navy, Office of Naval Records and Library, Washington, D.C. Government Printing Office. Brooks Shepard, Gordon. November 1918. The Last Act of the Great War. Cologne. ISBN 978-0-00-216558-7. OCLC 8,387,384. Chenin, Ferdinand. Versailles, 1919. New York. G.P. Putnam's Sons. Halperin, William. Anatomy of an Armistice. The Journal of Modern History 43. 107-112. DOI 10.1086 240590. ISSN 0022-2801. OCLC 263,589,299. Edmonds, James Edward. Baylis, Gwynnem. 1944. Baylis, Gwynnem, ed. The Occupation of the Rhineland 1918-29. History of the Great War. London. HMSO. ISBN 978-0-11-290454-0. OCLC 59,076,445. Kennedy, Kate, and Truly Tate, eds. The Silent Morning. Culture and Memory After the Armistice, 14 essays by scholars regarding literature, music, art history and military history. Table of contents. Lowry, Bullitt, Armistice 1918-245 pp. Persico, Joseph E. 11th month, 11th day, 11th hour, London. Random House. ISBN 978-0-09-944539-5. OCLC 224,671,506. Rudin, Harry Rudolph. Armistice, 1918. Ann Arbor. University of Michigan Press. Weintraub, Stanley. A Stillness Heard Round the World. The End of the Great War.